Hey folks, now before I get into this video, I just want you to watch it all the way through because there's a little bonus bit of information at the end that just relates to some of the equipment I recorded it on, and it'll maybe help you evaluate that bit of equipment. So watch through, and then that's another thing to add in the comments. Anyway, on with the video. So in today's video, I want to talk about a little problem with the X-S10 and the X-S20 with regards to using exposure compensation. So for those who may not know what exposure compensation is, quick recap. Essentially, if you let the camera control some of the settings, say the shutter or the aperture or the ISO, then it will use exposure compensation to darken or lighten the image. This is very different to full manual mode where you yourself control all the settings, but a very common setting on cameras is to use manual settings with auto ISO, and this is where the problem lies. So first of all, let's look at what the problem is. So essentially, in a nutshell, what the camera doesn't do is when it's in manual shutter, fully manual mode, manual shutter and aperture and auto ISO, is if you turn the ISO dial on an X-S20 or an X-S10, you kind of don't know where it is because the dial isn't marked. There's no indication of where it is. There is an indication on the screen, and I'm going to illustrate this in a second. But because of the way the camera works in auto ISO, you're not entirely sure where it is if you turn it and then change it again, because the camera is changing the ISO, and it'll also move the exposure meter, which indicates the exposure, depending on what the scene is seeing or what the photometry is set to. So it can get really confusing to work out what setting you're on. Conversely, if you look at something like an X-T5, it's marked on the dial, so it doesn't matter where the exposure meter is. If your dial says +1, you're at +1. So that's where the dial-based cameras actually have quite an advantage. So is there a workaround for this? Kind of. So let's illustrate what the problem is first. So in order to do this, we've had to, I did this at night time, these tests, so I had to set the camera to a very high ISO. And essentially, if the camera gets to the maximum of the permissible auto ISO range, it is unable to increase the ISO any further, so it won't change the exposure. So far, correct, that's how the camera should work. The problem is, if you keep turning the dial or inadvertently turn the exposure compensation dial, whatever dial is set to that, it still increments the exposure compensation. So if the lighting then changes and the ISO drops, you're not entirely sure how much you have changed the dial. Is it +1? Is it a third? Is it 1 1/3 stops? And that's, in a nutshell, as you can see that I've been showing you here with this little clip, that's what the problem is. You don't know where the dial is. Now, if obviously there is plenty of scope in the camera's range to change the ISO, you'll see that the dial responds as it should. It shows you where it is. Now compare this to one of the semi-automatic modes like shutter or aperture priority. So again, in these modes, you'll notice that you get a lot more information from the camera. First of all, it will change the setting that it can't adjust to red, and to tell you that you're not going to get the exposure with the current setting on the camera. And if you turn the dial, the exposure compensation dial, you'll note that it turns the text blue, and that it will always show +1, +2, etc. It will always show where you are, or -1, -2, regardless of whether the camera can actually change the settings to match that exposure. If it can, it'll do so. You'll see the settings change. If it can't, it'll display one of the settings in red. My question to Fuji would be, can we have a firmware update to fix this? Because why can't we have this behavior when we're using full manual with auto ISO? Let the camera say, turn the ISO red, we can't expose this, but still show me what the exposure meter is showing for the exposure, and have a separate, like a virtual dial that shows me where my exposure compensation dial is set. Because in effect on the X-T5, this is what you've got. You have your exposure dial, exposure meter, which will show where the exposure is. And then you look at your physical dial to know where your exposure compensation dial is set to, +1, +2, etc. And you can't do that on the X-S20 or the X-S10. The workaround, as I've kind of said earlier, is to go into either shutter or aperture priority. Say, for example, you're doing bird photography. You want, generally speaking, to have the aperture open wide. There are times you want to have control of the aperture, but generally speaking, you want your fastest aperture. So you can leave that to the camera. So you put the camera in shutter priority, so you're controlling the shutter. You set auto ISO, and the aperture will always be open widest, because if you're cranking the shutter speed up, the camera's naturally going to want to push the aperture up, and it'll always change the ISO first, and then it'll start changing the aperture, which of course, if you're ramping the shutter speed up, it's not going to close the aperture down. Conversely, if you're doing shutter priority and you reduce the shutter speed for whatever you're taking a picture of, then your shutter's going to close, your aperture's going to close down once it can't change the ISO, which might not be desirable. So although it's not a perfect workaround, generally speaking, for the types of scenario, I can't think of a scenario where you would want to, in sports photography, you're probably going to want the aperture wide open. But there might be times where you want to get more of a sports car on a racetrack in focus, and this fix won't work because you can't control the actual physical aperture precisely. Now, if we had this fix by Fuji in firmware, which I think would be easy to do, where we had a virtual dial, then I think with this virtual dial, we can see where the aperture priority setting is and very quickly work out, what we have or haven't done right with our exposure. Without it, you kind of like, you can't zero the dial easily. It's just really difficult to work out where it is because the dial's unmarked. You could put a sticker on it, but it won't work. But I'm joking there. But I'd hard cross my mind, do I put a sticker on the dial? And it's just because the dial isn't marked. It doesn't have a zero. All it would need would be like a zero mark, so it's always centered. It always zeroes that. Or if there was an option to zero the exposure compensation, reset it so it resets to zero. Either a button to do that, or a display that shows that, we can see the actual exposure and we can see the setting. Because when you take the picture and then you preview the picture on the camera, you'll actually see the baked-in exposure compensation setting that was set when you took the picture. That's the only place you can see it on the X-S20 and the X-S10. And it seems to affect their PSAM dial cameras. And it's a bit of a bind when you do bird photography, because I might be photographing a bird and then the lighting changes, and I use exposure compensation because I can react far more quickly by flicking a dial on the top of the camera with muscle memory than I can by trying to adjust the actual camera manually, because then I've got to have the camera in full manual mode. I'd have to have a full manual ISO set, and I want to work with an ISO range. The lighting can change quite dramatically when taking pictures of things, so it'll be something nice to have. So I hope the little tip helps give you some workaround to this problem, so that you can have a better idea of where your exposure compensation dial is, and basically shoot in shutter priority with auto ISO as well, and you can mitigate the problem and you'll see where the dial is. Like I say, it's clear that the dial, it displays in blue, like I said before, so you can see exactly where it is. Anyway, folks, I hope you got value from this video. Sorry I haven't done one for a while. It's been very busy at work, and with the dark nights coming in here in the UK, and difficult to fit in my runs and cycling that I do, which I'm happy to do in the dark now, so hey ho. But finally got a video out. And just for interest, if you watch to the end, this was shot on the X-S20 with the new Tamron 11 to 20mm lens at 20mm. So if you watch it back, you get a little bonus to see what this is like in video. Anyway, catch you later folks, bye!